Black girl's disturbing revelation at wedding sparks bride's 911 call on her own groom. The air crackled with anticipation as guests filed into the beautifully decorated reception hall. Crystal champagne flutes clinked, and the soft murmur of excited conversations filled the room. It was the wedding day. Everyone had been waiting for, a celebration of love, family, and new beginnings. But in a quiet corner, a little girl in a pink dress stood silent, her eyes haunted by secrets no child should bear. Her gaze kept darting to the gleaming microphone on the stage, a mixture of fear and determination etched across her young face. What dark truth was hiding behind her innocent facade, and how would her next actions turn this day of joy into a shocking expose that no one saw coming? Let's find out. But before we dive into this story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The last gasp of daylight clung to the Johnson home, reluctant to surrender to the encroaching night and the events it would bring. Its warm glow filtered through the scattered wedding decorations that adorned every surface. Delicate paper lanterns hung from the ceiling, their soft light mingling with the fading daylight to create an atmosphere that should have been festive, but instead felt oddly tense. Bouquets of flowers, their petals just beginning to unfurl, stood proudly on every available surface, their sweet scent permeating the air. In this dimly lit haven of anticipation, a scene unfolded that would set the tone for the events to come. The cellar door creaked open, its hinges protesting as if reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. From the shadows emerged Lily, a petite 9-year-old girl with wide, expressive eyes that seemed to hold secrets far beyond her ears. Her small hand was clasped tightly in the larger, rougher hand of her father, Robert. Robert's appearance was a stark contrast to the meticulously decorated home. His usually well-groomed hair was disheveled, stray strands sticking up at odd angles as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. His shirt, which had started the day crisp and pressed, now bore telltale wrinkles and was partially untucked. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They darted around the room, never settling on one spot for too long, as if searching for potential threats or witness. Yes, Lily's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions. Confusion clouded her young features, her brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of what had transpired in the cellar. But beneath the confusion lay a deeper, more troubling emotion, fear. It wasn't the typical fear of a child afraid of the dark or imaginary monsters. This was a visceral, all-encompassing fear that seemed to emanate from her very being. As they stepped fully into the living room, the front door swung open, and Grace, Lily's mother, bustled in. Her arms were laden with bags, evidence of last-minute wedding errands. Despite the clear exhaustion etched on her face, there was an undeniable excitement in her eyes. Tomorrow was to be her wedding day, the culmination of months of planning and years of love. "I'm home," Grace called out, her voice filled with a mix of relief and anticipation. She set her bags down and turned, freezing for a moment as she took in the scene before her. Robert and Lily emerging from the cellar, both looking somewhat worse for wear. A flicker of concern passed over her features, but it was quickly replaced by a tired smile. "There you two are," she said, moving towards them. "What were you up to in the cellar?" Robert's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent, his eyes now fixed on a point just over Grace's shoulder. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable as neither Robert nor Lily offered an explanation. Grace's smile faltered slightly, a crease forming between her brows. She glanced between her fiancé and daughter, noting the odd mood that seemed to hang in the air, but as quickly as the concern appeared, she dismissed it. "Pre-wedding jitters," she told herself. "It's natural for everyone to be a bit on edge, honey." She tried again, her voice a little louder this time, tinged with a hint of confusion. "Did you get wine together with Lily from the cellar?" Robert's response, when it finally came, was cold and detached, a simple yes that seemed to drop into the room like a stone, creating ripples of unease. Pushing aside her growing discomfort, Grace moved to embrace Lily. The little girl seemed to struggle internally for a moment before forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes as Grace hugged her daughter. She could feel a slight tremor running through the child's small frame. "Did you two have a good time together while I was at work?" Grace asked, trying to inject some warmth into the oddly chilly atmosphere. Lily's only response was a small nod, her eyes darting briefly to her father before fixing on the floor. As Grace straightened up, her ears caught fragments of a hushed conversation. Robert's voice, low and intense, muttered something about keeping things in line. The words sent a shiver down Grace's spine, but she quickly brushed it off. It's just wedding anxiety, she told herself firmly. Everyone's stressed, that's all. But as she looked at her daughter's downcast face and her fiancé's tense posture, a tiny seed of doubt planted itself in the back of her mind. She pushed it aside, focusing instead on the joy tomorrow would bring. After all, it was to be the happiest day of her life. What could possibly go wrong? As the evening wore on, the tension that had permeated the house earlier seemed to dissipate, replaced by the quiet routines of a family preparing for bed. The soft glow of Lily's nightlight cast playful shadows on the walls of her bedroom, transforming the space into a cozy sanctuary. Stuffed animals lined the shelves, their button eyes gleaming in the dim light, silent witnesses to the scene about to unfold. Grace had just finished tucking Lily, and her motherly touch lingering as she smoothed the blankets around her daughter's small form. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with Lily, but she attributed it to excitement about the wedding. After all, it wasn't every day that a little girl got to be a flower girl at her mother's wedding. As Grace rose from the bed, Robert appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. He nodded at Grace, a silent signal that it was time for their nightly chat. It had become a ritual in the weeks leading up to the wedding, a chance to discuss last-minute details and share their anticipation for the big day. They settled on the edge of Lily's bed, the mattress dipping slightly under their combined weight. Lily lay still, her eyes closed, but her breathing betrayed that she wasn't quite asleep. Yet the air in the room felt thick with unspoken words and hidden tensions. Grace's hands found her engagement ring, twisting it nervously around her finger. The diamond caught the light from the nightlight, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the ceiling. She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper as she voiced the concerns that had been plaguing her all day. "Are you sure everything's set for tomorrow?" she asked, her eyes searching Robert's face, the flowers, the cake. Her words trailed off, leaving the rest of her worries unspoken, but hanging heavily in the air between them. Robert's response was to his jaw clenching visibly as he spoke. "I've checked with the organizer. Everything will be fine." His tone held a hint of irritation, a sharp edge that cut through the softness of the moment. "How many times do you need to ask?" The harshness in his voice took Grace aback. She blinked rapidly, trying to process the sudden shift in his mood. This wasn't like Robert, or at least not like the Robert she thought she knew. But as she looked at him, really looked at him, she noticed the tightness around his eyes, the slight down of his mouth. He was stressed too, she realized, taking a deep breath. Grace tried to smooth over the moment. "I understand you're nervous too," she said softly, reaching out to place a hand on his arm. She could feel the tension in his muscles, coiled tight like a spring ready to snap. "It's a big day for both of us. I just want it to be perfect." She forced a smile, hoping to lighten the mood, to recapture some of the excitement and joy that should have been overwhelming them on the eve of their wedding. But as their eyes met, the tension between them was palpable. Robert's gaze was guarded, a wall seeming to have sprung up between them in the span of a single conversation. Grace's smile faltered, her heart rate picking up as she sensed the wrongness of the situation. Robert's defensiveness was a red flag, a warning sign flashing in her mind. But even as the doubt crept in, she pushed it aside. "It's just pre-wedding stress," she told herself again, the mantra becoming less convincing with each repetition. As they sat there, the silence stretching between them, Grace couldn't help but feel that something fundamental had shifted. The man sitting beside her suddenly felt like a stranger, his familiar features obscuring a person she wasn't sure she knew at all. But tomorrow was their wedding day, the happiest day of their lives, the beginning of their forever. Surely, once the stress of the preparations was behind them, everything would go back to normal, wouldn't it? With that thought clinging desperately to her mind, Grace leaned in and placed a gentle kiss on Robert's cheek. "Let's get some sleep," she whispered. "Big day tomorrow." As they left the room, neither noticed my eyes flutter open, watching them go, with a mixture of fear and sadness that no child should ever have to feel. The first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, heralding the arrival of the long-awaited wedding day. The house, which had been shrouded in tension the night before, now buzzed with a frenetic energy that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Grace was a whirlwind of activity, her hair still in curlers, as she rushed from room to room, double-checking every detail. Her wedding dress hung pristine on the back of the closet door, a vision in white that seemed to glow in the morning light. Despite the chaos, there was an undeniable spark of excitement in her eyes, a glimmer of the joy she had been holding on to through all the stress and doubt. "Lily, sweetie, have you seen my earrings?" Grace called out, her voice slightly muffled as she rummaged through a drawer. "The pearl ones Grandma gave me." Lily lingered in the background, her small form almost lost in the hustle and bustle of the morning preparations. She clutched her flower girl dress to her chest, the soft pink fabric a stark contrast to the anxiety etched on her young face. Her eyes darted around the room, always seeming to land on her father Robert, who was moving about with an energy that bordered on manic. The change in Robert's demeanor was striking. Gone was the irritable man from the night before. In his place was a whirlwind of cheerful efficiency, his smile broad and his laugh quick to bubble up. He swept into the room, adjusting his tie with one hand while balancing a tray of coffee cups in the other. "Here we go, coffee for the bride-to-be," he announced, his voice warm and jovial. He set the tray down and pulled Grace into a quick embrace, planting a kiss on her cheek. "Today is the day, my love. Are you ready to become Mrs. Robert Johnson?" Grace's face lit up at his words, the tension from the previous night melting away in the face of his enthusiasm. This was the Robert she knew and loved, the man she was excited to spend the rest of her life with. She leaned into his embrace, allowing herself a moment of pure, unadulterated happiness. "More ready than I've ever been," she replied, her voice soft but filled with certainty. As the couple shared their moment, neither noticed the way Lily flinched at her father's movements, the way her small hands tightened on her dress until her knuckles turned white. The doorbell's cheerful chime broke through the moment, heralding the arrival of Sarah, Grace's best friend and maid of honor. Sarah burst into the house like a force of nature, her arms laden with boxes of makeup supplies and hair accessories. "The cavalry has arrived," Sarah announced, her infectious grin spreading across her face. She set her boxes down and immediately took charge, her presence filling the room with a new energy. "All right, bride, in the chair. We've got some magic to work." As Sarah began transforming Grace into a vision of bridal beauty, Robert took the opportunity to help Lily into her flower girl dress. He knelt beside her, his movements gentle as he helped her slip the dress over her head. "There's my beautiful girl," Robert said, his voice warm as he smoothed down the fabric. "You're going to be the prettiest flower girl anyone's ever seen." But even as he spoke with fatherly pride, there was an undercurrent to his words, a subtle tension that seemed at odds with his cheerful demeanor. His hands lingered a moment too long on Lily's shoulders, his grip just a touch too firm. Lily stood still as a statue, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance. When Robert tried to engage her in playful banter, she flinched at his touch, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. But Grace, catching a glimpse of the interaction in the mirror as Sarah worked on her makeup, noticed a frown creased Grace's brow. For a moment, a flicker of concern passing over her features, but before she could dwell on it, Sarah was asking her opinion on lipstick shades, and the moment passed. Lily, seeking an escape from her father's attention, gravitated towards Grace. She began to help in small ways, holding a hairpin here, fetching a makeup brush there. Her movements were careful, almost robotic, but there was a desperation in her eyes, a need to be close to her mother that went beyond simple excitement for the day. As the morning wore on, the transformation continued. Grace's hair was styled into elegant curls, her makeup applied with expert precision. When she finally slipped into her wedding dress, the room fell silent for a moment, everyone taking in the sight of the radiant bride. "Oh, Grace," Sarah breathed, her eyes misting over, "you look absolutely stunning." Grace turned to the full-length mirror, her breath catching in her throat. As she took in her reflection, the dress hugged her curves perfectly, the delicate lace detailing catching the light. Her hair fell in soft waves around her face, and her makeup enhanced her natural beauty without overpowering it. For a moment, everything else faded away, the stress of the preparations, the lingering unease from the night before, it all disappeared as Grace gazed at herself, truly feeling like a bride for the first time. Mom, Lily's small voice broke through Grace's reverie. "You look like a princess." Grace turned, kneeling down to Lily's level, careful not to wrinkle her dress. She pulled her daughter into a gentle hug, feeling the girl's small arms wrapped tightly around her neck. "Thank you, sweetheart," Grace murmured, pressing a kiss to Lily's forehead. "And you look absolutely beautiful too, the most perfect flower girl I could ask for." As they embraced, Grace felt a tremor run through Lily's body, a silent SOB that the child quickly suppressed. Pulling back, Grace searched her daughter's face, concern flooding her features. "Lily, honey, what's wrong?" she asked softly, her thumbs gently wiping away the tears that had begun to form in Lily's eyes. But before Lily could respond, Robert's voice boomed through the room. "Time to go, ladies. We don't want to keep the guests waiting, do we?" The moment shattered. Lily pulled away from Grace, plastering a smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm okay, Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "just happy for you." As they prepared to leave for the venue, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but with the whirlwind of the wedding day sweeping her along, she pushed the concern to the back of her mind. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. After all, whatever was bothering Lily. They could deal with it after the ceremony. Little did Grace know that the vows she was about to take would be tested far sooner and far more severely than she could ever have imagined. The wedding venue was a vision of elegance and romance. Soft twinkling lights were strung across the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the space. Flowers in shades of white and blush adorned every surface, their sweet fragrance filling the air. The late afternoon sun filtered through GY curtains, bathing everything in a golden light that seemed to promise a perfect beginning to Grace and Robert's new life together. As guests began to arrive, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement and anticipation. The room filled with the sound of cheerful greetings, laughter, and the rustle of finery. Old friends embraced family members, wiped away tears of joy, and children darted between the legs of adults, adding to the festive chaos. Amidst this joyous scene, Lily stood apart, a small island of stillness in the sea of movement. Her pink flower girl dress, which had seemed so beautiful in the store, now felt constricting, as if it was squeezing the air from her lungs. She clutched her little basket of rose petals tightly, her knuckles straining with the effort. From across the room, Robert's eyes found Lily. He was in his element, moving from group to group, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with a broad smile. But even as he laughed at a joke or clapped a friend on the back, his gaze would inevitably return to his daughter, watching her with an intensity that seemed at odds with the celebratory atmosphere. Grace, resplendent in her wedding gown, was caught up in a whirlwind of last-minute preparations and greetings. She flitted from one group to another, her face glowing with happiness as she hugged relatives and posed for photos. But every so often her eyes would seek out a flicker of concern passing over her features before she was pulled back into the festivities. As the ceremony drew nearer, guests began to take their seats. The air was thick with anticipation, everyone eager to witness the union of the happy couple. Lily, still standing alone, watched as people passed her by, some pausing to coo over how adorable she looked in her dress. "Aren't you just the prettiest little flower girl?" an elderly aunt exclaimed, pinching Lily's cheek gently. "You must be so excited for your mommy and daddy." Lily forced a smile, the expression feeling foreign on her face. "Yes, ma'am," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the general din of the gathering. As the woman moved on, satisfied with Lily's response, Grace appeared at her daughter's side. She knelt down, careful not to wrinkle her dress, and took Lily's small hands in her own. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Grace asked, her voice soft with concern. "You've been so quiet all day. Is something bothering you?" Lily opened her mouth, words bubbling up inside her, threatening to spill out. But over Grace's shoulder, she caught sight of Robert. He was watching them, his expression unreadable. "But my..." Lily could feel the weight of his gaze. The words died in her throat. "I'm fine, Mom," Lily said instead, her voice small but steady, just a little nervous about walking down the aisle. Grace's face softened, relief evident in her eyes. "Oh, honey, you'll do wonderfully. Just remember to smile and drop the petals as you walk. And if you get scared, just look at me, okay? I'll be right there at the end of the aisle." Lily nodded, forcing another smile as Grace pressed a kiss to her forehead before being whisked away by the wedding coordinator. Left alone once more, Lily's smile faded, replaced by a look of resigned determination. As the music began to swell, signaling the start of the ceremony, Lily took her place at the beginning of the aisle. She could see Robert standing at the altar, looking handsome in his tuxedo, his smile broad as he waited for his bride. For a moment, Lily could almost believe in the fairy tale, the handsome prince waiting to marry his beautiful princess. But as she began her walk down the aisle, scattering rose petals in her wake, the weight of the secret she carried seemed to grow with each step. The smiling faces of the guests blurred together, their whispers of how adorable she looked fading into a dull roar in her ears. When she reached the end of the aisle, Robert's hand came to rest on her shoulder, his grip just a little too tight to be comforting. "That's my girl," he murmured, his voice pitched low so only she could hear. "Remember what we talked about." As Lily took her place to the side, her eyes found Grace radiant as she began her own walk down the aisle. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Lily saw nothing but love and joy in her mother's eyes. In that instant, Lily made a decision. She wouldn't ruin this day for her mother. She would keep smiling, keep pretending, no matter how much it hurt, because that's what good girls did, right? They kept secrets to protect the people they loved. As the ceremony began, Lily stood silent, the perfect picture of a flower girl, but inside a storm was brewing, one that would soon break over this picture-perfect wedding with devastating force. The ceremony had been a blur of tears, smiles, and promises of eternal love. Now, as the afternoon sun beat its descent, casting long shadows across the venue, the atmosphere had shifted from formal solemnity to joyous celebration. The wedding party and guests had gathered for a peaceful brunch, the tension from the ceremony gradually easing as champagne flowed and laughter filled the air. At the head table, Grace and Robert sat side by side, their hands intertwined on the tablecloth. Lily sat to Grace's left, pushing food around her plate more than eating it. The clinking of silverware against china provided a gentle backdrop to the murmur of conversation. Robert, his face flushed with happiness and perhaps a touch too much champagne, was in the middle of regaling the table with a story from his and Grace's early dating days. His free hand gesticulated wildly as he spoke, his voice carrying across the room, and there I was standing in the middle of the park, covered head to toe in mud, holding this tiny kitten I just rescued from a storm drain, Robert said, pausing for effect as the table erupted in laughter. And that's when Grace walked up. I thought for sure she'd turn and run, but instead, she just looked at me, smiled, and said, I hope you're planning on keeping that cat, because I think I'm falling in love with you. Grace finished, her eyes twinkling with mirth and memory. As the laughter subsided, a member of the venue staff approached the table, a slightly apologetic look on his face. Excuse me, Mr. Johnson, he said, addressing Robert. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but there seems to be an issue with your car. It's parked in a spot that's needed for an upcoming delivery. Would you mind if we moved it? Robert's smile never faltered as he reached into his pocket for his keys. Not at all, he said cheerfully. Go right ahead. Just be careful with her. She's my baby ass. He handed over the keys. Lily's eyes were drawn to the familiar keyring among the jumble of keys. One stood out, the old tarnished key to the cellar. Lily's heart began to race, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as memories flooded her mind. The dark cellar, the musty smell, the sound of the lock clicking into place. Without thinking, Lily leapt from her chair, nearly knocking it over in her haste. She threw herself at Grace, wrapping her arms tightly around her mother's waist and burying her face in the soft fabric of the wedding dress. Grace, startled by the sudden movement, instinctively wrapped her arms around Lily. Sweetie, she asked, her voice laced with concern. What's wrong? Lily couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to express the fear and anxiety that were threatening to overwhelm her. She just held on tighter, as if Grace could somehow protect her from the memories, from the truth that was clawing its way to the surface. Grace looked up, meeting Robert's eyes over Lily's head. She saw a flicker of something pass across his face before it was replaced by a look of fatherly concern, but that brief moment was enough to send a chill down Grace's spine, to awaken the doubts she'd been pushing aside all day. Lily, honey, Grace said softly, stroking her daughter's hair. It's okay, everything's okay. But even as she spoke the words, Grace felt their wholeness. Everything was not okay. Something was very, very wrong, and she'd been too caught up in her own happiness to see it. As the brunch continued around them, the happy chatter of stark contrast to the moment of tension at the head table. Grace held her daughter close, her mind raced, trying to piece together the clues she'd been ignoring. Lily's strange behavior, Robert's mood swings, the odd moments she'd glimpsed between father and daughter. What had she missed? What had she been too blind to see? As she sat there, one arm around Lily and the other still linked with Robert's, Grace felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice. Behind her lay the safe, happy life she thought she knew. Ahead was an unknown that terrified her. But as Lily's silent sobs shook her small frame, Grace knew she couldn't ignore her instincts any longer. Whatever was happening, whatever secrets were being kept, she had to find out the truth for Lily's sake and for her own. The brunch continued, the other guests oblivious to the drama unfolding at the head table. But for Grace, Robert, and Maya, the celebration had taken on a darker tone. The facade of the perfect family was cracking, and through those cracks a terrible truth was about to be revealed as the golden afternoon light began to fade, giving way to the soft glow of fairy lights and candles. The wedding guests made their way to the ceremony area. Rows of white chairs faced an arch entwined with delicate flowers and flowing fabric, creating a backdrop that seemed plucked from a fairy tale. The air was thick with anticipation, and the sweet scent of flowers. Soft music drifted through the space, a gentle prelude to the main event. Guests settled into their seats, programs rustling as they were opened and closed, voices hushed in excited whispers. At the front of the gathering, Robert stood tall and handsome in his tuxedo, a white rose pinned to his heel. His smile was broad, his eyes bright, as he watched the aisle waiting for his bride to appear. To all observers, he was the picture of a proud and happy groom eager to begin his new life, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of more than just wedding day nerves. His gaze kept flicking to Lily, who stood off to the side, clutching her basket of flower petals with white-knuckled hands. The music swelled, signaling the start of the procession. The guests rose as one, turning to watch as the bridal party made their entrance. First came the bridesmaids, their dresses a soft blush that complemented the floral arrangements perfectly. They glided down the aisle, their faces swathed in smiles as they took their places opposite the groomsmen. Then came Lily, her small form seeming even tinier as she stood at the head of the aisle. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes wide as she took in the sea of faces turned towards her, but then her gaze found Grace, waiting just out of sight, and something in her mother's smile seemed to give her strength. With careful steps, Lily began her walk, scattering rose petals in her wake. Her movements were mechanical, her smile fixed and unnatural. As she passed the rows of guests, there whispered comments about how adorable she looked, washed over her without registering. When she reached the end of the aisle, Robert's hand came to rest on her shoulder. To the guests, it looked like a tender, fatherly gesture, but Lily flinched almost imperceptibly, her smile faltering for just a moment before she took her place, standing as still as a statue. And then the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The music changed, the familiar strains of the wedding march filling the air as the guests turned once more, rising to their feet as Grace appeared at the end of the aisle. She was a vision in white, her dress hugging her curves before flowing out into a modest train. A delicate veil obscured her features, but even through the GY material, her radiant smile was visible in her hands. She clutched a bouquet of roses and baby's breath, their soft colors a perfect complement to her ensemble. As Grace began her walk down the aisle, her eyes locked with Robert's. In that moment, all the doubts and concerns that had plagued her seemed to melt away. This was her wedding day, the beginning of her happily ever after with the man she loved. But even as she reveled in the joy of the moment, a small part of her couldn't help but notice the way Lily stood rigid and unsmiling beside her soon-to be husband. It was a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony, a reminder of the unease that had been growing all day. Pushing the thought aside, Grace focused on her walk, on the faces of her friends and family beaming at her from either side of the aisle. This was her moment, the culmination of all her dreams and planning. As she reached the altar, Robert extended his hand to her. She took it, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers, the slight tremor in his fingers that spoke of his own nervousness and excitement. "You look beautiful," Robert whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Grace's smile widened, her heart swelling with love. "Thank you," she murmured back. They turned to face the officiant, their hands still clasped tightly together as the ceremony began. The words of welcome and the readings chosen to celebrate their love washed over them. But even as Grace stood there ostensibly living out her dream wedding, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way Robert's hand gripped hers a little too tightly, or the way Lily stood silent and unmoving, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance, or perhaps it was just the culmination of all the little moments of unease she'd been pushing aside for weeks. As the officiant invited them to share their vows, Jasmine took a deep breath. This was at the moment she pledged her life and love to Robert. But as she turned to face him, ready to speak the words she'd carefully crafted, she caught sight of Lily over his shoulder, and in her daughter's eyes she saw a pain and fear so profound that it stole her breath away. In that instant, standing before their gathered friends and family on the cusp of making a lifelong commitment, Grace felt the first real crack form in the foundation of her perfect day, and deep down she knew that before this wedding was over, everything she thought she knew about her life and her love was about to be turned upside down. The ceremony had concluded with a kiss that sealed Grace and Robert's union, met with enthusiastic applause from the gathered guests as the newlyweds made their way back down the aisle, showered with rose petals and well wishes. The atmosphere was one of unbridled joy and celebration. The reception area was a marvel of elegant decoration, twinkling lights cast a warm glow over tables dressed in crisp white linens and adorned with centerpieces of blush roses and baby's breath. A string quartet filled the air with soft melodies, providing a refined backdrop to the excited chatter of the guests as they found their seats. Grace and Robert made their grand entrance hand in hand to a standing ovation. They looked every inch the perfect couple, Grace radiant in her gown, Robert dashing in his tuxedo. They moved to the center of the dance floor for their first dance, swaying gently to the music as cameras flashed and guests wiped away tears of happiness. But even as they twirled across the floor, lost in each other's eyes, there was an undercurrent of tension that neither could fully ignore. Grace's mind kept drifting back to the moment during the ceremony when she'd seen the pain in Lily's eyes. Robert, for his part, seemed hyper-aware of their surroundings, his gaze constantly flickering to the edges of the room, as if searching for something or someone. As the dance ended and the couple made their way to the head table, the festivities began in earnest. Champagne flowed freely, laughter echoed through the room, and the dance floor quickly filled with jubilant guests eager to celebrate the union of Grace and Robert. Amidst all the joy and RRY, Lily sat quietly at a corner table, picking at the food on her plate without really eating her flower girl dress, which had seemed so pretty and princess-like that morning, now felt constricting, as if it were squeezing the air from her lungs. Guests would occasionally stop by her table, commenting on how adorable she looked or asking if she was excited about her mom and dad getting married. Lily would force a smile and nod, giving the responses she knew were expected of her, but as soon as they turned away, her face would fall, the mask of happiness slipping to reveal the fear and confusion underneath. Robert, ever the gracious host, moved from table to table, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with a broad smile. But even as he laughed at jokes and reminisced with old friends, his eyes would inevitably drift back to Lily. There was something possessive in his gaze, a hint of warning that sent a chill down the spine of anyone observant enough to notice. One such observer was Sarah, Grace's maid of honor and best friend. As she watched Robert's interactions with Lily from across the room, a frown creased her brow. She'd known Grace and Lily for years, had watched the little girl grow from a bubbly toddler into the quiet, withdrawn child she saw before her. Now the change was stark, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Deciding to investigate, Sarah made her way over to Lily's table. She pulled out a chair and sat down, her bridesmaid's dress rustling softly as she leaned in close to the little girl. "Hey there, sweet pea," Sarah said gently, her voice pitched low to be heard over the music and chatter. "How are you holding up? It's been quite a day, hasn't it?" Lily looked up, her eyes wide and wary. She glanced quickly around the room as if checking to see who might be listening before answering in a whisper, "I'm okay, and Sarah, just tired." Sarah's frown deepened. The Lily she knew would have been bouncing off the walls at a party like this, not sitting alone and looking like she wanted to disappear. "Are you sure that's all, honey? You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" For a moment, it seemed like Lily might say more. Her lower lip trembled and tears welled up in her eyes, but before she could speak, a shadow fell over the table. "There's my little princess," Robert's voice boomed, falsely cheerful. "Are you having fun, sweetheart?" Mai flinched at the sound, her small body seeming to curl in on itself. "Yes, Daddy," she murmured, her eyes fixed firmly on the tablecloth. Robert's hand came to rest on Lily's shoulder, his grip just a little too tight to be comfortable. "Why don't you come dance with your old man?" "Hush, show everyone those moves we've been practicing." Without waiting for a response, Robert guided Lily to her feet. As he led her away, he turned back to Sarah with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks for keeping an eye on her, Sarah. I've got it from here." Sarah watched them go, a knot forming in her stomach. The interaction she just witnessed set off every alarm bell in her head. She resolved to talk to Grace as soon as possible, to voice her concerns about what she was seeing. Meanwhile, Grace was caught up in a whirlwind of congratulations and wishes. She moved from group to group, her face aching from smiling so much, but her heart full of joy. This was everything she'd ever dreamed of, surrounded by loved ones, married to the man she adored, with a bright future stretching out before her. But even in her happiness, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Her eyes kept seeking out Mare in the crowd, worry creasing her brow each time she caught sight of her daughter's solemn face. As the evening wore on, the subtle signs of discord became more apparent to those paying attention. Lily's reluctance to engage with Robert, the way she seemed to shrink away from his touch, Robert's overly controlling behavior, the way his eyes would narrow when Lily spoke to anyone else for too long. Guests began to notice, exchanging worried glances and hushed whispers behind raised hands. "Did you see the way he grabbed her arm? The poor child looks terrified. Should someone say something to Grace, but no one wanted to be the one to shatter the illusion of the perfect day. After all, it was a wedding. Surely, any family tensions would smooth themselves out once the stress of the event was over. As the reception neared its end with the cake cut and the bouquet tossed, an air of expectation filled the room. It was time for the speeches, for heartfelt words to be shared about the happy couple. Sarah stood tapping her glass gently with a spoon to call for attention. As the room quieted, she began to speak, her voice warm with affection for her friend. But even as she extolled Grace's virtues and wished the couple every happiness, her eyes kept drifting to Maya, concern evident in her gaze. Next came Robert's best man, full of jokes and good-natured, ribbing the room filled with laughter, the tension of the evening momentarily forgotten in the face of his humorous anecdotes. And then it was Robert's turn. He stood raising his glass in a toast to his new wife. His words were beautiful, full of love and promises for the future, but as he spoke, his free hand rested on Lily's shoulder, his fingers digging in just a little too hard. As the guests applauded Robert's speech, Lily's eyes met Grace's across the room. In that moment, mother and daughter shared a look of such profound sadness and fear that it took Grace's breath away. The perfect facade of the day began to crumble, revealing the cracks that had been there all along. And as the evening drew to a close with sparklers lit and the newlyweds preparing to depart, a sense of foreboding settled over the gathering. This was supposed to be the beginning of a beautiful new chapter, but for Lily, and perhaps for Grace too, it felt more like the start of a nightmare from which there might be no waking. The reception was in full swing, a whirlwind of music, laughter, and celebration. Champagne flutes clinked together in joyous toasts, the crystal chandeliers casting a warm golden glow over the festivities. The air was thick with the mingled scents of flowers and wedding cake, a perfume of happiness and new beginnings. At the center of it all, Grace and Robert swayed together on the dance floor, lost in each other's eyes. Grace's wedding gown sparkled under the lights, and Robert's tuxedo was impeccable, making them look every inch the perfect couple. Guests watched them with misty eyes, sighing over the apparent love between the newlyweds. But amidst all this joy, one small figure stood apart. Lily, still in her flower girl dress that now seemed to hang on her small frame like a cage, stood at the edge of the room. Her eyes darted around nervously, taking in the sea of smiling faces and clinking glasses. The happiness that surrounded her felt alien, almost mocking in its intensity. As the song ended and another began, Lily's gaze fell on the small podium near the dance floor. The microphone stand still stood there, a remnant from the earlier speeches. It seemed to call to her, offering a chance to finally be heard above the noise of the celebration. For a moment, Lily hesitated. Her father's warnings echoed in her mind, the threat of punishment looming large. But as she watched her mother laughing in Robert's arms, something inside her snapped. She couldn't bear it any longer, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. With a determination that belied her young age, Lily began to move. Her steps were slow at first, almost hesitant, but gained speed. As she approached the podium, a few guests noticed her movement, their conversations trailing off as they watched the small girl with curiosity. As Lily reached the microphone, a hush began to fall over the room. The DJ, noticing the change in atmosphere, gradually lowered the volume of the music. Grace and Robert, caught up in their dance, were among the last to realize something was happening. Lily's small hands gripped the microphone stand, her knuckles white with the effort. She had to stand on her tiptoes to reach the microphone, but her voice, when it came, was clear and strong, cutting through the last vestiges of celebration like a knife. "Dad always locks me in the cellar." The words hung in the air, shocking in their simplicity and the pain they conveyed. The room fell utterly silent, as if all the air had been sucked out in an instant. Guests froze mid-motion, champagne flutes halfway to lips, forks suspended over half-eaten slices of cake. For a moment, no one moved. Then, like a slow-motion replay, heads began to turn, eyes swiveled from Lily to Robert and back again, trying to make sense of what they just heard. Grace stood frozen on the dance floor, her arms still wrapped around Robert's neck from their dance, her face drained of color, the joy of moments before replaced by shock and disbelief. She pulled away from Robert, her eyes seeking out her daughter Lily. Grace's voice trembled as she spoke, barely above a whisper, but audible in the deathly quiet room. "Lily, what did you just say?" Lily's eyes locked with her mother's, and in that moment all the fear and pain she'd been holding back came rushing to the surface. Tears began to stream down her face, but her grip On the microphone never wavered. "Dad always locks me in the cellar," she repeated, her voice stronger this time, fueled by the release of her long-held secret. "He puts me there when you go to work. I have to sit on the old sofa for hours and hours." A collective gasp went through the room. Guests began to murmur, the sound growing like a wave. As the implications of Lily's words sank in, some looked horrified, others confused, and a few turned accusing eyes toward Robert. Robert, for his part, stood rooted to the spot on the dance floor. His face had gone pale, a sheen of sweat visible on his forehead. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the shocked and disgusted faces of their friends and family. For the first time, he looked truly afraid. Grace's mother was the first to break the paralysis that had gripped the room. She rushed to Lily's side, wrapping her arms protectively around her granddaughter. "Oh, my poor baby," she cried, her voice choked with emotion. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" As if her movement had broken a spell, the room erupted into chaos. Voices rose in anger and confusion, demanding explanations and expressing outrage. Some guests moved toward Robert, their faces dark with fury, while others surrounded Grace, offering comfort and support. In the midst of it all, Grace stood alone, her wedding dress suddenly feeling heavy and constricting. She looked from Lily sobbing in her grandmother's arms to Robert, who was beginning to back away from the advancing crowd. The perfect day she had imagined, the happy future she had planned, was crumbling around her, and as the realization of what had been happening right under her nose began to sink in, Grace felt something inside her harden. The shock and disbelief gave way to a cold, clear anger. Whatever happened next, whatever explanations or excuses Robert might offer, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The fairy tale wedding had become a nightmare, and in its wake, a family would be forever changed. The once joyous reception hall had transformed into a scene of chaos and confusion. The music had long since stopped, replaced by a cacophony of shocked whispers, angry outbursts, and muffled sobs. The air, which had been filled with the scent of flowers and wedding cake, now felt thick and oppressive, heavy with the weight of Lily's revelation. Grace stood at the center of it all, her wedding dress a stark contrast to the turmoil surrounding her. Her mind raced, trying to process what she had just heard, the pieces of the puzzle she had been subconsciously gathering over the past months. My increasing withdrawal, Robert's mood swings, the tension she had sensed but ignored, were suddenly clicking into place, forming a horrifying picture. With a sudden burst of energy, Grace strode towards Robert, who was still standing frozen on the dance floor. Her eyes, which had been wide with shock, now narrowed with a fierce, protective anger. "Robert," she said, her voice low and dangerous, cutting through the noise of the room, "what is Lily talking about? Why would she say you lock her in the cellar?" Robert's eyes darted around the room, looking anywhere but at Grace's face, which had been pale with shock, now flushed red. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Answer me," Grace demanded, her voice rising. "What does she mean by that? Why would you do that, Robert?" As she confronted Robert, Grace saw his eyes flick towards Lily, who was still being comforted by her grandmother. The look in his eyes, a mixture of anger and something darker, sent a chill down Grace's spine. Without thinking, she moved to block his line of sight, positioning herself between Robert and their daughter. "Don't you dare look at her like that," Grace hissed, her protective instincts flaring. "Lily, honey, what do you mean? Please tell me what's been happening." Lily, still clutching the microphone like a lifeline, looked at her mother with tear-filled eyes. "He puts me in the cellar when you go to work," she repeated, her voice small but clear in the hushed room. "He says I have to be quiet and sit on the old sofa. He brings other women to the house." A collective gasp went up from the assembled guests. Grace felt as if the ground had dropped out from under her feet. She turned back to Robert, her face a mask of fury and betrayal. "Is this true?" she demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. "Have you been locking our daughter in the cellar, bringing other women into our home?" Robert, seeming to finally find his voice, took a step towards Grace. "Jazz, baby, you can't believe this," he said, his tone pleading. "She's just a kid. She doesn't understand what she's saying. I would never." But before he could finish, Grace's father stepped forward, placing himself between Robert and his daughter. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't get to speak to her right now. How dare you let our granddaughter wait alone in the cellar for hours?" The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Robert's friends, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing unease, now moved to his side. "Come on, man," one of them said, placing a hand on Robert's shoulder. "This is all just a misunderstanding, right? You wouldn't do something like that." But their words of support died on their lips as they saw the look in Robert's eyes, not of innocence or confusion, but of a man caught in a trap of his own making. Grace's mother, still holding Lily close, spoke up. "We always knew something wasn't right," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger, and regret the way Lily would flinch. When Robert came near how quiet she'd become, we should have said something sooner. The realization that others had noticed something amid that there had been signs she had missed or ignored hit Grace like a physical blow. She felt as if she were drowning, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. But as she looked at Lily, saw the fear and relief wearing in her daughter's eyes, Grace felt a surge of resolve. Whatever had happened, whatever Robert had done, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she had to protect her daughter. With a deep breath, Grace straightened her spine and faced the room. "I'm calling the police," she announced, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. This is not okay. None of this is okay." As she reached for her phone, Robert lunged forward, his face contorted with panic. "Grace, no, you can't do this. You don't understand." But before he could reach her, Grace's father and several other guests moved to restrain him. The room erupted into chaos once more, with shouts and cries filling the air as Robert struggled against those holding him back. Amidst the mayhem, Grace dialed 911, her hand shaking as she held the phone to her ear. As she waited for the operator to answer, she looked at Lily, still clutched in her grandmother's protective embrace. In that moment, Grace made a silent vow: no matter what happened next, no matter what it cost her, she would make this right. She would protect her daughter, even if it meant tearing apart the life she thought she knew. The once festive reception hall had devolved into a scene of chaos and raw emotion. The air was thick with tension, the happy chatter of moments ago replaced by angry voices and muffled sobs. In the center of it all stood Grace, her wedding dress now feeling like a costume in a play gone horribly wrong. As Grace waited for the 911 operator to answer, her mother's voice cut through the air sharp with anger and regret. "We always knew something wasn't right," she exclaimed, her arms still protectively wrapped around Maya. "How could we have let this go on for so long?" Grace's father, his face red with fury, pointed an accusing finger at Robert. "You think this is acceptable?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You've put our granddaughter in the cellar so you can cheat on your wife. Don't you ever dare to look me in the eyes again." Robert, still restrained by several guests, looked wildly around the room. His eyes were wide with panic, darting from face to face as if searching for an ally, someone who might believe his side of the story. But he found no sympathy in the sea of shocked and disgusted expressions surrounding him. "Please," he pleaded, his voice cracking, "this is all a misunderstanding. Lily's just confused. She doesn't know what she's saying." But his words only served to fuel the anger in the room. Guests who had been quietly observing now stepped forward, voices rising in a chorus of outrage. "How dare you accuse that child of lying?" One of Grace's aunts shouted, her face contorted with disgust. "I always thought there was something off about you," another guest chimed in, shaking his head in disbelief. The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Robert's friends, who had initially moved to support him, now stepped back, UNC certainty and horror dawning on their faces as the reality of the situation sank in. Amidst the chaos, Grace finally connected with the 911 operator. Her voice trembled as she spoke, the words feeling surreal as they left her lips. "Yes, I need help. My wedding reception is getting out of control. There's a problem with my husband, and the situation is escalating. Please, we need assistance." As Grace laid the situation to the operator, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Sarah, her maid of honor and best friend, standing beside her. Sarah's face was a mask of concern and determination. "Grace," Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible over the commotion, "I'm so sorry. I should have said something sooner. I noticed Lily acting strangely, but I didn't want to ruin your day. I never imagined." Grace reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand, unable to form words but grateful for the support. As she finished her call with the operator, she turned back to the room, her mind racing with what needed to be done next. "The police are on their way," she announced, her voice carrying over the noise. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. In that moment, despite the turmoil of emotions swirling within her, Grace felt a sense of clarity and purpose she had never experienced before until they arrived. She continued, her voice growing stronger, "I want Robert out of this room. I don't want him anywhere near Lily." As if her words had broken a spell, people sprang into action. Several of the male guests moved to escort Robert out of the hall, ignoring his protests and struggles. Grace's parents huddled closer to Lily, forming a protective barrier around the child. Grace made her way to her daughter, kneeling down in front of her despite the voluminous wedding dress she took Lily's small hands in hers, looking into her eyes with a mixture of love and regret. "Lily's sweetheart," she said softly, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea this was happening, but I promise you it's over now. Daddy will never make you feel scared or unsafe again." Lily threw herself into her mother's arms, her small body shaking with sobs. Grace H. held her tightly, her own tears falling freely now around them. Family and friends watched with tear-filled eyes, the weight of what had transpired settling heavily on everyone's shoulders as they waited for the police to arrive. A sense of grim determination settled over the gathering. What had started as a celebration of love had transformed into something else entirely, a call to action, a moment of reckoning. The facade of the perfect family had been shattered, but in its place a stronger, more genuine bond was forming. Grace knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles, therapy sessions, and countless tears, but as she held her daughter close, she also knew that they would face it together, surrounded by the love and support of those who truly cared for them. The sound of sirens pierced the night, growing louder as they approached the wedding venue. The once festive atmosphere had been replaced by a tense, almost suffocating stillness. Guests huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. Grace stood at the center of it all, her wedding dress now feeling like a costume in some twisted play. She held Lily close, one hand stroking her daughter's hair soothingly while the other clutched her phone, ready to make any necessary calls. Her parents flanked them protectively, their eyes scanning the room as if expecting Robert to burst back in at any moment. The double doors of the reception hall swung open, and two police officers strode in their presence, immediately commanding attention. The lead officer, a tall woman with a stern expression, approached Grace. "Mrs. Johnson," she asked, her voice professional but tinged with compassion. Grace nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "I'm Officer Chin," the policewoman continued. "We received a call about a disturbance at a wedding reception. Can you tell me what's going on?" As Grace began to explain the situation, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word, a commotion erupted from the hallway outside. Robert's voice, loud and desperate, could be heard protesting his innocence. "You don't understand. This is all a misunderstanding. Jasmine, please tell them." The second officer moved swiftly to the door, hand on his holster, ready to intervene if necessary. But before he could reach it, Robert burst into the room, his face red and contorted with a mixture of anger and fear. He had managed to break free from the guests who were keeping him isolated, and now he stood there, chest heaving, eyes wild as they darted around the room. The atmosphere in the hall shifted instantly. Guests who had been watching the scene unfold now moved to form a human barrier between Robert and his family. Grace's father stepped forward, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "That's close enough," he growled, his voice low and threatening. Officer Chin reacted quickly, moving to intercept Robert before he could get any closer to Grace and Lily. "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down and step back," she said firmly, one hand raised in a stopping gesture, while the other rested on her holster. But Robert was beyond reason, his eyes locked onto Lily, who was clinging to Grace and trembling visibly. "Lily, sweetie, tell them the truth," he pleaded, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "Tell them Daddy never hurt you. We were just playing. Remember, it was our special game." His words sent a collective shudder through the room. Grace felt a surge of nausea, the implications of what Robert was saying hitting her like a physical blow. She turned Lily's face into her side, trying to shield her from Robert's words and the horror of the moment. "That's enough," Officer Chin said sharply. In one swift motion, she pulled out her handcuffs. "We're going to need you to come with us. We have some questions we need to ask you down at the station. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the officer began to recite Robert's rights, he seemed to deflate the fight, leaving him all at once. He offered no resistance as Officer Chin cuffed his hands behind his back, his eyes never leaving Grace. "And may I, Jazz, please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now you know me, you know I would never." But Grace turned away, unable to look at the man she had thought she knew, the man she had promised to spend her life with mere hours ago. She focused instead on Lily, on the feel of her daughter's small body pressed against her, on the enormous task that lay ahead of them. As Robert was led out of the hall, Officer Chin turned back to Grace. "Ma'am, I know this is difficult, but we're going to need to take a statement from both you and your daughter. Is there somewhere private we can talk?" Grace nodded numbly. "The bridal suite," she said, her voice hoarse. "We can use that." As they prepared to leave the reception hall, Grace's mother stepped forward. "Wet coming with you," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument Lily needs all of us right now. Officer Chin nodded her understanding, and together the small group made their way out of the hall. As they walked, Grace could feel the eyes of every guest on them, could hear the murmur of shock and sympathy. The weight of what had happened, of what was still to come, settled heavily on her shoulders. But as they entered the quiet of the bridal suite, as she sat down with Lily on her lap and prepared to recount the horrors that had been happening, Grace felt a steely resolve form within her. This was not the end of her story or Lily's. It was a terrible, painful chapter, but it would not define them. As she began to speak, her voice grew stronger with each word. They would get through this, they would heal, and they would do it together, surrounded by the love and support of those who truly cared for them. The days following the wedding passed in a blur of police statements, tearful conversations, and sleepless nights. Grace felt as though she were moving through a fog, her mind still struggling to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the monster Lily's revelations had exposed a week after the ill-fated wedding. Grace stood in the living room of the home she had shared with Robert, surrounded by boxes and the worried faces of her parents. The house, once a symbol of the life she thought she was building, now felt tainted, every corner holding the potential for painful memories. "Are you sure you want to do this now, sweetie?" Grace's mother asked, her voice gentle. "We could wait, give you more time to process everything." Grace shook her head firmly. "No, Mom, I need to do this. We need to do this for Lily." As if summoned by her name, Lily appeared in the doorway, her small face solemn. Grace's heart clenched at the sight of her daughter, at the weight of responsibility that now rested solely on her shoulders. "Come here, baby," Grace said, opening her arms. Lily rushed into them, burying her face in her mother's stomach. "We're going to make this house ours again, okay? Just you and me." Lily nodded, her grip on Grace tightening. "No more cellar?" she asked in a small voice. "No more cellar," Grace confirmed, fighting back tears. "And no other women at our house. Never again, I promise." With renewed determination, Grace turned to the task at hand. Room by room, they went through the house, removing every trace of Robert. His clothes were packed into boxes for donation. His books and personal items were sorted, some to be returned to him via his lawyer, others to be discarded. As they worked, Grace's father took charge of changing the locks. The sound of drilling filled the air as he installed new, sturdier locks on all the doors, including the cellar. Each turn of the screwdriver felt like another barrier being erected between their past and their future. "I've called a security company," he announced as he finished with the front door. "They'll be here tomorrow to install an alarm system. No one's getting in here without your say." "So, Grace?" Grace nodded, gratefully feeling a small measure of relief at her father's words. Safety had taken on a whole new meaning in the wake of Lily's revelations. As the day wore on, the house slowly transformed. Robert's presence, once so pervasive, began to fade. In its place, Grace started to see possibilities: a fresh coat of paint, here new curtains, their Myers drawings proudly displayed on the fridge instead of hidden away. By late afternoon, they had filled Grace's father's truck with boxes to be taken away. As he prepared to leave, he pulled Grace into a fierce hug. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," he murmured. "You're so strong. You and Lily are going to be okay." Grace clung to him, drawing strength from his embrace. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered, "for everything." As the truck pulled away, Grace turned back to the house. Her mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner, while Lily sat at the table coloring quietly. The scene was so normal, so domestic, that for a moment Grace could almost pretend the last week hadn't happened. But then she noticed the way Lily's eyes kept darting to the cellar door, the tension in her small shoulders. There was still so much healing to be done, so many wounds to mend. Grace took a deep breath and walked over to Lily, kneeling beside her chair. "Hey, sweetie," she said softly, "what do you think about redecorating your room this weekend? We could paint it any color you want." Lily's eyes lit up, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Can we make it purple?" "Purple it is," Grace agreed, her heart warming at the sight of her daughter's smile. "And maybe we could get some new toys too." "How does that sound?" As Lily nodded enthusiastically, already describing the shade of purple she wanted. Grace felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with therapy sessions, legal battles, and countless challenges. But in this moment, watching her daughter's excitement over something as simple as redecorating her room, Grace knew they would make it through. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a new rhythm began to take shape in the household. The house, once a silent witness to hidden horrors, was gradually transforming into a sanctuary of healing and hope. Grace threw herself into the task of remaking their home, as if by changing their physical Surroundings she could somehow erase the painful memories that lingered in every corner of the walls. Once a neutral beige that Robert had insisted upon now bloomed with color. Lily's room was a vibrant purple just as she had requested, while the living room was painted a soothing sage green that seemed to breathe new life into the space. But it wasn't just the aesthetics that were changing. The energy of the house itself felt different. Where once there had been tension and secrets, now there was an openness, a commitment to honesty that permeated every interaction between mother and daughter. One sunny afternoon, as Grace hung Lily's artwork on the fridge, something Robert had always discouraged, claiming it made the kitchen look messy, she heard a small voice behind her. "Mommy," Lily said, her voice hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" Grace turned, kneeling down to Lily's level. "Of course, sweetheart, you can ask me anything, anytime." Lily fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, her eyes downcast. "Is his daddy ever coming back?" The question, so innocent, yet laden with fear, hit Grace like a physical blow. Grace took a deep breath, steadying herself before answering. "No, sweetie," she said softly but firmly. "Daddy isn't coming back. What he did was very wrong, and he needs to face the consequences of his actions. But more importantly, I need to keep you safe. You're the most important person in my life, Lily, and I promise I will always protect you." Lily nodded slowly, her small face a mixture of relief and sadness. "I'm glad Hugh's not coming back," she whispered, "but I'm also scared. What if he tries to find us?" Grace pulled Lily into a tight hug, her heart breaking at the fear in her daughter's voice. "Oh, sweetheart, you don't need to be afraid. We have a new security system, remember? And Grandpa and Grandma are just a phone call away. We're safe here, I promise." As she held her daughter, Grace silently vowed to do everything in her power to make Lily feel secure again. She knew it would be a long process, but she was determined to see it through. The following days were filled with small steps towards healing. Grace had arranged for Lily to start seeing a child psychologist, Dr. Amelia Rodriguez, who specialized in helping children cope with family problems and emotional challenges. The first few sessions were difficult, with Lily often returning home quiet and withdrawn, but slowly, session by session, Grace began to see changes in her daughter. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, now adorned with a cheerful yellow tablecloth that Lily had picked out, Grace noticed Lily pushing her food around her plate, a telltale sign that something was on her mind. "What's up, sweetie?" Grace asked gently. "Did something happen at school today?" Lily shook her head, then seemed to gather her courage. "Dr. Emmy asked me today if I wanted to talk about the cellar," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace felt her heart rate quicken, but she kept her voice calm. "And did you want to talk about it?" Lily nodded slowly. "I told her about the old sofa and how dark it was and how scared I felt," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing ever happened to me, but I felt so alone in the cellar. I could hear Dad talking with other women upstairs, and I didn't like that. It made me feel sad and confused." Lily's lower lip trembled. "Is it okay that I told her?" "Oh, Lily," Grace said, moving to kneel beside her daughter's chair, "it's more than okay. I'm so proud of you for being brave enough to talk about it. That's how we start to heal, by talking about the scary things and realizing that they can't hurt us anymore." As Lily leaned into her mother's embrace, Grace felt a mixture of pain at what her daughter had endured and hope for the future. They were making progress slowly, but surely. The healing process wasn't just for Lily, though. Grace found herself grappling with a whirlwind of emotions: guilt for not noticing the signs earlier, anger at Robert for his betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility for Lily's well-being. As time passed, small moments of joy began to punctuate their days more frequently. Lily's laughter, once so rare, now echoed through the house. She started inviting friends over for play dates, something she had always been reluctant to do before. Grace watched in amazement as her daughter slowly began to reclaim her childhood. On this particular afternoon, a burst of laughter drew Grace from the kitchen where she'd been preparing dinner. Following the sound, she found herself at the entrance to the living room, a smile tugging at her lips. At the scene before her there, on the plush rug they had picked out together, sat Lily, surrounded by her grandparents. Her grandfather was in the middle of telling a story, his hands gesticulating wildly. Lily's eyes were wide with wonder, her giggles punctuating his tale. Her grandmother sat close by, occasionally interjecting with playful corrections. Quietly, Grace joined them, sitting down beside Maya. Without hesitation, Lily leaned into her mother's side, her small hand finding Grace's. As the story concluded with a burst of laughter, Grace felt an overwhelming wave of emotion. This was family, this was love, this was what truly mattered. Without a word, they all moved closer, enveloping each other in a warm embrace. Lily looked up at her mother, her eyes shining. "I love you, Mom," she said softly. In that moment, Grace felt a profound realization wash over her. This was true family, not the facade she had tried to maintain with Robert, but this unconditional love and support surrounding her now, despite everything they had been through, she found herself filled with gratitude for these people who had stood by her side through the darkest times. Grace felt tears of joy prick at her eyes. "I love you too, sweetheart," she replied, her voice thick with emotion more than anything in this world. She looked around at her parents, her heart swelling with appreciation. "And I love all of you. Thank you for being our real family, the ones we can always rely on no matter what." Her parents tightened their embrace, wordlessly conveying their unwavering support in this circle of love. Grace knew that they could face anything together. The painful chapters of their past would not define them. Instead, they would use those experiences to become stronger, more compassionate, and more appreciative of the precious bonds they shared. If Lily and Grace's story of courage and healing touched your heart, make sure to subscribe for more powerful and inspiring stories. If you were in Lily's shoes, would you have had the courage to speak up against your own father? Let us know in the comments below. I would love to hear your opinion. Disclaimer: this channel is in opposition to all forms of human rights violations, intolerance, bigotry, and discrimination. The narratives that are presented here are original works that were designed to encourage constructive dialogue, comprehension, and introspection. Respect for diversity and the preservation of human dignity are the guiding principles for the creation of all content.